single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. Governor Kathy Hochul recently signed a legislative package meant to expand support and protections for workers across the state. The move comes at a time when the National Labor Relations Board does not have a full quorum, preventing the body from actively completing its work. The legislative package includes a bill that would allow the State Labor Board to assist workers while the National Board is not fully functioning. It also includes measures that would protect union workers from wage reduction and further strengthen protections against layoffs. For more on the legislative package, our Elise Klein spoke with the bill's sponsors, supporters, and labor workers for a complete picture of its impact. Here's that story.
At a time when workers continue to face uncertainty with many federal changes, New York is striving to provide additional support. At the beginning of September, Governor Kathy Hochul signed a package of labor laws intending to expand labor protections in the absence of a fully functioning National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB. One of the new laws intends to grow the workforce by requiring contractors and subcontractors doing work for covered renewable energy systems to have apprenticeship agreements. The bill also requires thermal energy networks to require contractors and subcontractors to have pre-apprenticeship direct entry providers registered with the State Department of Labor. State Senator Jessica Scarcella-Stanton, a Democrat representing parts of Staten Island and a lead sponsor of the bill, says this new law could impact workers and the state.
When we're growing the economy, it's really important to think about jobs, and not just jobs that kind of come and go. It's jobs that can turn into careers. And that's exactly what this does. And when you have jobs that turn into careers, you have people who are then giving back and investing into the economy.
State Senator Chris Ryan, a Democrat representing parts of Onondaga and Oswego counties and a member of the Labor Committee, says as new sectors, technology and energy sectors grow, apprenticeship language is important to grow the workforce.
It's tremendous. It just makes sense. It's just really good policy. It helps develop our next generation of workforce, and helps not only does it help generate the next generation of workforce, it helps those that are in these types of sectors, in the trades and the growing sector of energy.
In addition to growing the workforce, another bill signed by the governor intends to protect workers in the workforce from wage reductions. One of the bills signed would protect certain employees from wage reductions due to their involvement in a violation investigation of a workplace violence program. Senator Ryan, who sponsored the legislation, says this bill will rectify an issue that was previously hurting workers via wage reductions.
That's the purpose. The purpose of the bill is to close that loophole so that nobody would have to go without pay for being called into or participating into some sort of investigation. So, because it wasn't exactly clear, what we did is we clarified that and we codified it.
Joshua Terry with the New York Labor Union Civil Service Employees Association says this is a defect from a nearly 20-year-old workplace violence law that helps keep workers safe through the development of safety plans, and it must be fixed. He highlights their union members wouldn't necessarily be paid if they were helping with safety plans and or walkthroughs from the Department of Labor after an incident.
These plans help save employers money. These are things that protect their workers, it protects on workers' comp costs. So to make sure that they are compensated just as they are under general health and safety plans, which is in a different section of law, we thought was really important.
These are issues strongly supported by many lawmakers. Both Senator Scarcella-Stanton's apprentice bill and Senator Ryan's wage reduction protection bill had strong support from both sides of the aisle, passing nearly unanimously in both houses. The labor law package includes another bill that would authorize the State Public Employment Relations Board to assert jurisdiction over disputes between employers and recognized employee organizations if the NLRB is unable. State Senator Jessica Ramos, a Democrat representing parts of Queens, a lead sponsor of the bill and the chair of the Labor Committee, says this bill is about having mechanisms in place to protect New York's workers.
Well, I'm very thankful to Governor Hochul for signing this bill into law even prior to the government shutdown, because New York State should exactly be focused on preparing for failure to deliver services at the federal level, and because we have a responsibility to protect New Yorkers.
The bill passed both houses during the most recent legislative session and was signed into law at the beginning of September. Many lawmakers say this bill is important to ensure workers have resources to assist them. The bill would authorize the applicability of the State Labor Relations Act, which means an alternative option for New Yorkers in need of labor dispute assistance. The bill designates the State Public Employment Relations Board as the alternative route for workers who cannot access assistance from the NLRB.
And we, of course, want to make sure that workers in New York State are safe on the job, that they're being paid the wages that they've earned, and that their collective bargaining agreements are being adhered to. So we have to have the mechanisms in place to make sure that we're protecting New York's workers.
After the law was signed, the National Labor Relations Board filed a lawsuit claiming the New York State law is preempted by the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. The NLRA, signed into law in 1935, guarantees the private sector the right to unionize and collectively bargain. Later in 1959, a Supreme Court decision set a legal precedent stating that states cannot regulate labor management disputes that are within the NLRB's jurisdiction. Kathy Creighton, director of Cornell University's Buffalo CoLab, says the federal labor law is old, outdated, and ineffective.
Basically, federal labor law has ossified the labor movement in America, in my opinion, because the law is old and has not been updated. It has really been ineffective in allowing employees to organize and bargain.
The National Labor Relations Board is currently not operating fully, lacking a quorum after President Donald Trump fired member Gwen Wilcox, leaving the board with only 2 members. Trump also signed an executive order that called for the downsizing of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service to its minimum statutory level, which led to the removal of about 95% of staff. Creighton says these actions have impacted the National Labor Relations Act and made it even less efficient.
It's a very important part of the statute is to have mediation, because one of the primary reasons for having the National Labor Relations Act and the State Labor Relations Act is that the state has police powers to make sure that its economy functions properly for all New Yorkers.
NLRB Acting General Counsel William Cowan argues that workers and employers can access regional offices in the absence of a board and mediators.
As it relates to the quorum on the board, the presence or absence of a quorum does not slow down the other arms of the agency. And in 2011, the board made it clear by a series of delegations that it is the policy of the board that all functions continue in the absence of a quorum.
Cowan adds most matters are resolved via the regional local arms of the agency. Terry says while regional offices can handle things like issues with union drives and votes on unfair labor practices, they can't handle everything.
But anything beyond that, if there is contention that an employer illegally interfered with within an organizing drive or fired employees who were leading the drive, that's where it would rise above the regional offices and require NLRB nationally to be involved. And that is where we are kind of would be at a stalemate if we continue to lack quorum over the long term.
Theo Moore, a labor advocate and the executive director of Align, says this law will uphold basic worker protections. Moore adds the NLRB regional offices are often understaffed and underfunded.
So workers really can't depend on that. So if there are workers who are looking to unionize right now, whether it be the Starbucks workers, the Amazon workers, they have to do it without the support of the NLRB, and they know this.
WMHC reached out to the NLRB Council for follow-up questions. Cowan stresses again the absence of a quorum doesn't impair the agency's ability to investigate, potentially settle, or litigate cases. He says the authority in these circumstances goes to the General Counsel. Cowan adds while there is a backlog of cases and funding challenges, the men and women of the agency represent the finest in public service, and it is the agency's responsibility to prioritize hiring and allocation of resources accordingly via the funding they do receive. The lawsuit is currently in preliminary stages. Cowan says the state has responded and been cooperative.
The idea is that they sort of realized that this question needs to be addressed. And so we've reached an understanding that we will proceed with our request for a preliminary injunction. We'll file briefs and get argument on that and get that resolved.
Meanwhile, many state lawmakers and labor advocates are frustrated by the whole dispute, hoping the law upholds in the end. Paul Son with the National Employment Law Project says federal leaders can't have it both ways.
They can't, kind of grind the NLRB to a halt, but then claim that the federal law prevents states from stepping in and protecting their workers. And we think the courts will find that compelling.
Senator Ryan says the state needs to step in because the federal government appears to be unwilling to support workers' rights.
Quite frankly, not just the Trump administration, but also every member of Congress who supports a non-functioning National Labor Relations Board doesn't support workers' rights. And I don't know how anybody does that. These are people that go to work and make our state run. So our issue is, if you're going to basically not have a functioning National Labor Relations Board, then you know what? We'll do it.
Senator Ramos adds the NLRB is not only not functioning, but their priorities seem to be backwards, focusing more on businesses' best interests. Ramos says this is exactly why her bill is so important.
So what we're doing here is exactly that, making sure that we're protecting New York's workers, because that's our job.
State Senator Rob Rawlson, a Republican representing parts of Orange County and a member of the Labor Committee, says while generally he doesn't think the dispute is totally without merit, there has to be a way to keep things moving in the state.
I think there is merit in that somebody, whether it is at the federal level or at the state level, needs to have jurisdiction to help settle disputes, because you don't want the prolonged dispute, which has a ripple effect throughout the economy and also affecting the workforce and the businesses that employ these people.
Moore stresses there are basic workers' rights that must be protected, and workers are depending on the state to step in.
You know, with an administration in Washington, D.C. that is hostile to unions, and with the absence of a functional NLRB that is, been filled with Trump's cronies, we now look at the New York State Public Employment Relations Board to step in to address union organizing, collective bargaining, and other workplace disputes.
The State Public Employment Relations Board, who in this law would serve in the replacement type role while the National Labor Relations Board is disbanded, declined to comment because of the pending litigation process. Son says he thinks the court will favor the state.
There's every reason to believe that the lower federal courts will recognize that there's not a functioning NLRB, and that states shouldn't be blocked from stepping in and playing this role that actually states played before the NLRA existed. New York's labor relations system predates the existence of federal law.
But in the meantime, while the legal process plays out, some labor experts are worried about what will happen to workers. Creighton says workers will be impacted negatively.
They won't have this option available to them to go to the states. They will have to resort to an NLRB that is not properly functioning. It only now has one member and very few federal mediators and very few staff.
Other union representatives are also worried, hoping this dispute is resolved quickly.
As of right now, there's really not much recourse. And so we would really love the courts to rule on this as fast as possible so that we can have some finality with what workers are going through.
It's hard to say how long this legal process could take at this point, but there are 2 NLRB member nominations, either pending a Senate vote or committee approval. Terry says it's their hope this legal dispute pushes the NLRB back into action. Elise Klein, New York Now.
Next year will mark the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. While this is a huge historical milestone for the nation, it is also a big moment for New York State. New York has several sites from the American Revolution that the State Parks Office works to preserve each year. In this next segment, we'll sit down with Daniel Mackay, who serves as the Deputy Director of Historic Preservation with the State Parks Office, about New York's role in that history and legacy. Here's that conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Happy to be here.
Now, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, can you help us understand the role of New York in that history and legacy?
New York State is at the heart of the American Revolution. And while Massachusetts lays claim to the start, Lexington and Concord and the Boston Tea Party, and Virginia claims the last major military engagement with the British, everything in between happened here in New York. The social history here, the military history, the families that were torn apart by siding, by being split, by siding with both the British and with the colonists. It's complex, it is rich, it is deep, And there are sites across the state that have that story to tell and collectively tell that story quite effectively.
Can you tell us about some of the historic sites of the American Revolution that are in and around the state? What are the significance of these sites?
So starting with New York State Parks, there are over 50 state parks and historic sites that have some connection to the Revolutionary War. And, there's the signature sites like Washington's headquarters in Newburgh. And then there's sites like right here in the Capital Region. You've got Schuyler Mansion, where Philip Schuyler of Hamilton fame lived his life as a family man, as the owner of enslaved people, as a general in the American Revolution. A very complex history in that family. It also includes sites like Fort Craylow across the river in Rensselaer, which is the site where chronologically you would probably start your tour through the historic site system, because that site is dedicated to the Dutch colonial period here in New York. In between and across the state, there are historic forts, Crown Point, Fort Niagara. There is, outside of Rochester, an extraordinary site called Ganondagan, which interprets the history of the Seneca Indian, both historically and contemporaneously. And the experience of the Native Americans in that time frame is complex. There were Native American tribes that sided with the colonies, and there were Native American tribes that sided with the British. And the interplay just on that Native American issue spanned the Hudson, from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. So it's a very deep, rich, complex history.
Can you tell us about the work your office is doing to preserve and maintain these sites?
Sure. These are obviously sites that require a great deal of stewardship, and that work begins at the regional and site-specific level with highly competent staff, interpretive staff, site managers who have been engaged with their regional directors and with my office, which sort of provides technical support to the historic site system. And so we are overseeing interpretive programming development, new exhibits, creating and fabricating new exhibits for installation at those sites, and also advising on what type of repairs or improvements sites need, not only to steward a historic property, but to create ADA access and meet other accessibility challenges. So the totality of that investment is significant and ongoing.
Yeah, I can imagine. How does your office approach research and documentation as it relates to these sites?
We have substantial research capability here. We have master's and PhD qualified staff that are doing deep research on the stories that each site can tell. And there has been, I think to date, a fairly predominant main narrative, which has tended to focus on the owners of the property, the founding fathers, whether it be John Jay or others that are the Livingston family. And what we've tried to do over the last decade is actually shift the focus, not away from those primary characters, but to elevate the secondary, the additional stories on site. So the stories of the enslaved people who supported the working farms of like founding father John Jay. The work, the engagement of women and children in those families. What were their roles and how did they engage with the moment and the challenges of the American Revolution? You can move through our historic site system chronologically and follow the story. You can also move through it thematically. And it's the ability of our site system to hand off a visitor from one site to the next. But it's also it's our intent to be able to pass a visitor off to a locally owned site or to a national park site, so that all these sites begin to blend together. I mean, in total, there's probably over 200 publicly owned sites that have a Rev War historical connection, and they each have an authentic story to tell.
Given that rich history of the American Revolution, I was curious how your office was ensuring that visitors of these sites are understanding the complete history of the American Revolution, and especially, as you mentioned, all of the different types of people and groups that were pivotal to that war.
The agency The division here, which I oversee, has made a commitment to what we are, a complete history approach. And it's one that does seek to intentionally elevate additional stories at any particular site. And what we have chosen to call it is our whole history. And that approach, one that we are hoping to further formalize sort of agency-wide, is one that is committed to the basic concept that there is a richer, deeper history to be told about virtually every site.
And how does your office balance the sometimes competing interests when it comes to preservation of the sites, but also encouraging, visitation to these sites?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. The preservation of the sites is paramount. It's one thing to go to a singular museum to learn about the American Revolution, and so there are obviously museums and exhibits that intend to deliver those facts. We think the authentic experience is out in the field. It's on the location. It's on the hillside. It's with the view that Washington had in the 1700s in Newburgh is geographically speaking largely intact today. Yes, there's modern construction and buildings in that viewshed, but his view of the Hudson is still intact there. His view south down to West Point is still intact there. So I think there's something to be said about preserving building and infrastructure and viewshed, which our agency is very committed to.
And how are you hoping to ensure that future generations keep a connection to that history of the American Revolution and just, the legacy of the war?
Yeah, one of the, we are building a great deal of digital content, and that is designed to, what digital content gives us is the ability to be nimble, to adapt and incorporate new information as it is researched and published. And so it also extends the footprint of the historic site system. I mean, it extends it globally through the internet, but I feel like the intent of that digital content is to, you can only fit so much information in a display case or so much information in an exhibit. And so the digital content allows people to access primary documents, see the sources where we are generating our content from, follow leads down interesting rabbit holes to other pieces of the story. And so that digital content piece is something that we have really shifted focus to. And we're actually going to be using some of the Rev 4 New York State 250th Commission allocation to further expand the digital content platform. We have about 3,000 pages of content that we will be putting up fully onto the web that tells the full history of New York during that Revolutionary War period.
Very important work, and we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
And we were speaking with Daniel Mackay, Deputy Commissioner for Historic Preservation at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, PBS will be premiering a new landmark documentary produced by Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, and David Schmidt. The documentary will be airing across PBS stations starting November 16th. Here's a trailer from that film.
From a small spark kindled in America, a flame has arisen, not to be extinguished.
We think about independence movements of the 20th century. You don't always recognize the fact that the United States actually started that.
The American Revolutionary Movement served as a model for freedom from oppression.
America is predicated on an idea that tells us who we are, where we came from, and what our forebears were willing to die for.
Collins said no taxation without representation. The fear was, if we give in to this precedent, what will they do in the future?
Crisis changes people. It gave different people different ideas about what they should be doing.
It gave them a space to make this democracy real.
The founders thought we can start over again. We can begin the world anew.
The British objective is to suppress the rebellion, force them to acknowledge the authority of the king.
Washington understands the war he's fighting. He doesn't have to win. He only has not to lose. He becomes quite eloquent in trying to persuade people we're all Americans.
We see regiments with individuals who are not carrying arms, doing essential labor, including women.
They are at the forefront of this movement.
One of the most remarkable aspects is that you had such different places come together as one nation.
It mushrooms into a global campaign that touches Europe and all parts of the world.
It so excites us that we are the product of a revolutionary moment where the world turned upside down.
To believe in America is to believe in possibility.
Well, that does it for this edition of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,